What's up everyone, welcome back to Dev Cafe. My name is Michael, and in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to make news article cards just like these as web components. At first glance, these appear like any other HTML element with an image, some text, and a hover effect. But when I inspect them, what we see inside is not really a standard HTML element. It is a custom web component that has a title attributes, an href, an image source, as well as some description text. So what's a web component anyway? Well, according to the good old MDN, web components is a suite of different technologies allowing you to create reusable custom elements with their functionality encapsulated away from the rest of your code and utilize them in your web apps. In other words, web components provide us with a native set of APIs that allow us to extend HTML elements and create reusable components without the use of any JavaScript frameworks. The MDN website mentions three important concepts to understand when working with web components. One of those is custom elements, then there's shadow DOM and HTML templates. I'm going to cover pretty much all of these as part of this tutorial. So let's just dive right into some code here to get started. Okay, so what I've got here is just a VS Code project with an HTML page. So let me go ahead and serve with live server here. And I've already templated out this card using some HTML. So I've got just an article element here, inside of it an inner div with an image, and then I've got an h1 tag and a paragraph tag for the description. And up above, I've created some styles specific to this card that are here. And then above that are just some generic styles to style the page around of this card element. So what we're going to do is take this HTML that's in here and convert it into a web component. First thing I'll do is create a new JavaScript file and name it newscard. Next, I will link this file to my HTML page. After that, I will go into this newscard file and create a new class called newscard. And this class is going to extend the HTML element. And so this is a pretty standard way of creating web components. So what we do is we just have a class with a custom name, and then that class extends the HTML element that is provided to us by the browser. Next, I'll create a constructor. And inside of that constructor, I will call super to inherit all of the parents elements. I'm also going to have a method here called render, which will end up rendering our web component. Now, I'm going to go back here, and for now I'm going to comment out this article piece, which is pretty much the card component itself. And what I'm going to do is put in news card. And because ultimately this is what we want to end up with. We want to end up with a component that will take in a title. And I'm just going to copy the title from here. Hello Planet Earth. We also want this component to take in an image URL as an attribute. So I am image source. I'm going to copy that from here as well. Okay. And lastly, we want this to take in an href. Google.com. And then last piece here will be the description, which I will put in here for now, and I'll explain a little bit later about how this works and how to retrieve that in our web component. But for now, I'm going to place it here, and we're going to just know that it's there. Obviously, we don't see anything here because our all we're seeing is just this description text that we pasted in between these news card elements. Next, we'll create the render method, and the render method will take in HTML. So this dot inner HTML equals backticks. And what I'm going to do is go in here and actually uncomment this for now. Copy. Actually, let's do cut. And then paste this in. Get my spacing right. Perfect. Okay, so that's the HTML. Next, I'll take the styles that are specific to just this news card, so anything from here down. And right above, I'll create a style tag. And in between here, I'm going to paste in my styles that are specific to the news article card. Let's go ahead and get our spacing correct here. Perfect. Now, as you see, I still have nothing here, and that's because I need to register my custom web components with the documents. So to do that, we'll say window.customElements, and then we're going to say news card, and then we're going to reference this class that above that we created called news card. So we'll pass in news card, and then the last thing I'll do is create one of the lifecycle methods that this HTML class gives us is called connected callback. What this method does is it executes anything that you put inside of it whenever the web component gets mounted to the DOM. In our case, all we wanted to do is render the inner HTML of the component. So I'll say this.render. And for some reason, my component is not rendering, and I think I found an issue here. This part needs to be window.customelements.define. And once I put that in, now my news card is actually rendering. And if I right click inspect, I can now see that it is appearing as a news card element. So our custom component is working as it should. As you can see, this text inside of here is still hard-coded into our HTML. And so if I change this to, let's say, Hello Earth, the text has not changed in our component here. So what I need to do is take my attributes and place them inside of this template so that I can have these be dynamic based on the attributes that I set here. One cool thing that web components give us is a way to access these attributes. So we can say this.get attribute and then put in the name of the attribute. So in our case, it'd be title. And now we can see that it says Hello Earth, which is exactly what we have here in the title. So if I change this back to Planet Earth and hit save, our component updates. And as you might imagine, we can do the same thing for the image as well. So I can say this dot, we use a template string, this dot get attribute, image source, and we should see nothing change because we're using the same exact URL. The last piece is this description, and I'm gonna just for now put in something called slot here, and I'll show you in a bit how this works. So now our web component appears to be working, but there's one small problem. When I go into here, we have a class called title, which styles the title of the card. So if I go to my general, so I'm going to delete these now because we have added them to our component, so we don't have double the styles. Now if I go into outside HTML page and I give this h1 tag a class of title, because this is something that could potentially happen to anyone. You know, this is a very common class that titles are given, and so we could have classes clash with each other. And this is exactly what happens actually. When I hit save, what happens is now our encapsulated styles from inside the component are bleeding out into the outer page. To prevent this, we have to use something called shadow DOM. And the way we do this is by first attaching something called shadow root to our web component. So we'll say this dot attach shadow, and inside of this method we will pass in a config object that says mode open. So there are two modes, open and closed. 99% of the time we want to use open. After we attach the shadow DOM, as you can see, our component has completely disappeared from the page. And the reason is because when you attach shadow DOM, you have to create a template element inside of your component. What I'm going to do here is in our render method, I'll put in a new const template. And then we'll do a document.create element. Create elements, and then in here I'll put in template. Then we'll want to attach this inner HTML to our template. So I'll say, instead of this .inner HTML, I'll say template .inner HTML. Now, as you see, the second I did that, all of a sudden our styles, so our title style, is no longer having an effect on this general page style. Okay, so the next thing I'll do is attach our template to the shadow root. So let me show you what I mean. So we'll say this dot shadow root, and this shadow root property is something that this HTML element class automatically gives us. And so the second you call this method here, it basically creates this shadow root property that now has the shadow root that you can attach your HTML template to. So we'll say shadow root dot penchild, and then we'll pass our template dot content, so the inner contents of our template, and then we're going to make a copy of it and pass it into our shadow root. And so now we've got our template attached to the shadow root, and our web component appears on the page once again. So you can see here what's happening under the hood is we have this news card element now that is a custom web component, and inside of it you see something called shadow root. And then and so what we did here is we took our template and attached it to the shadow root. And what the shadow root does is it encapsulates your component from any outside interference with styles, basically. So any outside style cannot have an effect on your web component. And likewise, any style that you have inside of your web component cannot have an effect on the outside page. The other thing you may notice is that our description has appeared again, and that is because we've put in the slot element. And what the slot element does is it takes anything that's inside of the tag here, and you can basically tell it exactly where in your template you want that the contents to be placed into. This is pretty much as far as we're going to take this web component, but there's one last thing, and that is clicking on it. When we click on this, we want to make sure that we open the URL to which this component is linked. And so to do that, now there are a couple of ways I could approach this. One way it would be to wrap the whole article elements into an anchor tag. But since we're already in JavaScript land, what I'm going to do is I'll just say this.shadowRoot, And then we're going to say .query selector. And then we're going to select our article. And then we're going to give it an event listener of click. And then pass in a callback. And so what we're going to do inside of this callback is say documents dot location dot href equals this dot get attribute href. And so what this will do is every time we click on this, it'll actually take us to the href that we pass into it as an attribute. The last thing I want to do here is show you how this would actually get used if you were to place this into an application. So the first way, of course, that it would get used is you would import this news card file into any app that you currently have written in any framework, and just drop this component in, import your newscard.js file, and then you can dynamically populate these using any templating language that your framework provides. Now, what if you just wanted to use vanilla JavaScript to sort of grab a whole bunch of news stories and loop through them and display each one on the page? Let me show you exactly what I mean. So I'm going to create a new file called app.js, and instead of importing the newscard.js file, I'm going to import app.js, and I'm going to say type equals module. Next, I'm going to go into my newscard.js file, and in here I'm going to say export default class. Then in here I'm going to say import news card from news card. What we're going to do is we're going to fetch a whole bunch of news articles from a subreddit called Uplifting News. So if you go to reddit.com/r uplifting news. So this is the subreddit, and the way to get a JSON output from any subreddit is to add .json at the end. And so what that gives us is basically a JSON output just like this. And so what I'm going to do here is do documents dot add event listener DOM content loaded, because we want to make sure that our DOM is actually loaded before we go ahead and make the request to get those news articles from Reddit. And I'll put in an async method here. And then, so I'll leave this blank for now, because the next thing we're going to do is create a method for fetching the news. So I'll say async function fetch news, and then what we'll do is say const response equals await, and then we're going to use the browser's fetch API or fetch method, and I'm going to just take this and copy it, and then out of this method we'll return response.json. You know, one thing I realized is I didn't put .js here, and so my news card had disappeared from here, but I went ahead and put .js, and that pretty much fixed it, and now our news card is back in our browser. So next, we're gonna fetch some headlines. So I'll say const headlines equals await fetch news const news container. And I'll show you in a sec here what this element is. Dot query selector. ID of news. What this news selector is this element here. So essentially what we're going to be doing is we're going to be taking this and appending a whole bunch of these news cards to it repeatedly. So in a loop, basically. So actually for now, I'm going to delete this, or maybe I'll just comment it out just so it's not getting in the way. Next, I'll go back to this app.js file. So now that we got our headlines and we've got our news container, I will go ahead and say headlines dot data dot children dot for each. I'll get rid of that, and then I'm gonna say headline. And the reason I'm doing headlines.data.children.for each is because if we go into our network tab here, let me zoom this out a little bit. If I go into the network tab here, let me hit refresh on the page. You can see the request to the Reddit API, and this is just the way the data comes back from Reddit. So we can see data, children, and then inside of it you have each individual story, which also has a data attribute that you can drill into. So I'm gonna say headline, and then what we're gonna do is create a new instance of the news card. So I'll say const news card equals news card, and this is our class that we imported above from the newscard.js file. So now we have an instance of our news card. So basically the idea is we're gonna create a new element instance, and then what we'll do is we'll basically set each attribute. And the last thing we'll do is append the card to the DOM. Okay, so let's set each attribute. So the way we set an attribute of a custom component, or any HTML element really, because at the end of the day it's just an extended HTML element, is we do newscard dot set attribute. Title, and then we'll put in the headline dot data dot title, and then let's set the href newscard dot set attribute href headline dot data.url, and then let's do the image source newscard.setAttribute image src, and then that will be headline.data.thumbnail. And then the last thing we'll do is set the slot, so like this element here, and or the inner text of the tag. And the way we're going to do that is just say newscard dot inner text equals headline dot data dot. Since these responses from Reddit don't really have a description, I'm just going to use the title here. But as you know, if you use some other API that fetched news and you had like a short excerpt or a description, you could just call that here. But just for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to use the title as both the title and the description. All right, and so the last thing then that's left to do is to take our news container and then append our news card. So as we're looping through each one of the headlines, we're gonna create a news card, set all of its attributes, and I just realized I made a little typo here, and then append each one to our news container, which is this div here. All right, so I just realized something. I did not create a new instance of my class. I just assigned news card to news card, and my console actually yelled at me here. So what I'll do is say new news card, and there we go. Now we've got each individual web component populated with unique news article. So yeah, that's basically it. This is how you create a basic web component. Of course, there's a lot more, and you can do things like events that you can pass up into your parent elements. But that's probably a whole other topic to dive into. But this should be enough to get you started with web components. So yeah, thank you so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please subscribe. If you found this video useful, please give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next one.